we're a little past 12, so we'll just ask everybody to kind of say a little bit about themselves. But so I've been with the AMA for 3 years now. I am now taking on the president role from Lauren. So we're in the middle of transitioning. So this will be my first year as president of the AMA. I'm also the director of marketing and sales for Butler Technologies, and I mentioned to you that we're into wearable technology. Haven't always started in that space. We started off doing user interface devices, so membrane switches, graphic overlays, medical instrumentation, industrial controls. And so that's kind of more recently morphed into some of the wearables. So we do biometrics and heaters for clothing. And so we're expecting that to kind of take off with everything going in the pandemic, being able to do remote health monitoring, taking a look at biometrics remotely. So that's one of the things that we're looking into heavily.
Good.
Yeah, so I mean, if we could maybe take a little bit and everybody introduce themselves, maybe what we can do is start with, it looks like Ashley's on. Ashley, would you mind?
Yeah, I have no problem with doing that. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah.
Awesome. I wasn't sure if it was working. I was using the web interface instead of the real Zoom. Hi everyone, my name's Ashley Foster. I actually work with Jamie at Butler Technologies. I think Jacqueline's also on the call with us too. My role is really just based around some of the analytics and maybe a little bit of advertising and a smidge of graphics.
All right, Jacqueline?
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess I'll go next. I'm Jacqueline King, and I am a digital marketing specialist at Butler Technologies as well. I'm mainly the content creation, social media management, heavily into blogging. So really just all of the face, I guess, and promoting our company. So.
Great. Craig, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
I'll be happy to, and I'm actually outside here, so I hope the audio is okay.
Sounds great.
Oliver, nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you, Craig.
We used to see each other pretty regularly at IEBC events.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, my name is Craig Irons. For almost 20 years, I was at DDI in Bridgeville, and was in a marketing communications role. My last role there was content manager. We had a COVID-related staff reduction back in April. Let a lot of people go. Unfortunately, I was included in that. So right now I'm between assignments, I guess you could say. And I've been eyeing joining the AMA here. And so this is the first AMA event I've attended. So, and when I saw today that Oliver was the presenter, and I know he's fantastic, I thought this would be a great one to spend some time with today. So hopefully I'll get an opportunity to meet all of you here moving forward.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us, Craig. Jesse, would you like to say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Jesse Witham. I have a digital marketing agency. Specifically, we specialize in SEO. Been doing it for about 15 years. Heard good things about Oliver and your presentation. So looking forward to learning some things and participating in the discussion.
All right, great. Lindsay, you're just joining us. Would you mind saying a few things about yourself and who you're with?
Hi, this is Lindsay. I work at Sojourner House. I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator. And Sojourner House is located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we provide recovery and treatment and housing to mothers with children.
Okay, thanks for joining us. And Jenny. Jenny, are you on? Well, it doesn't sound like she's able to answer. So why don't we get started? Our speaker today is Oliver Schmidt. He comes to us from C4CS, and he's going to be talking to us on crisis. This is part of our Marketing Monday communication series. So we're having a speaker every Monday, just talking to us about various marketing topics. So Oliver, thank you for joining us and agreeing to talk. And I'd like to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate it. Also appreciate the shout out, Craig. Great to have you. I was asked to talk a little bit today about crisis communication amid COVID-19. And the way I have structured this is I've 6 components, and the next slide will introduce you to the agenda. But let me maybe to say a few words about myself. I don't want to drag this out a long time, but I think it's important for you all to know that the company I run, C4CS, has been in Pittsburgh for quite some time by now, founded in the 1990s in Charlotte, North Carolina, in Pittsburgh roughly since 2004, 2005. And we do 2 things. We do crisis management from an operational standpoint, and we do communications. We call it strategic communications, and where these 2 areas overlap is where you find crisis communication. And we do a whole lot of work in this particular realm. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about what we're doing and how we see the world in terms of the strategic approaches. I believe webinar timing wise, I have about 35 minutes or so before we will go into a Q&A. We're very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts, specific questions. That would be great toward the end. And I would love to handle questions, probably better to do that toward the end since we have a Q&A rather than during the session. If you do want to use the chat function to go ahead and convey something, that's fine. But my clear preference would be everybody comes on live and asks questions, and I can respond to that having listened to the audio at the end, because we're a small group to begin with. You know? All right. Last time I spoke to the AMA was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. That was regarding media relations, along with a colleague of mine, Cynthia Cavendish-Carey. Back then, this was a very different world. We were able to interface with the members directly. We had a dozen or so in a nice conference room. Now we're on Zoom. And I've, as you probably assume, done a whole lot of Zoom webinars and calls and so forth. And this is one of them. Today, I will talk a little bit about crisis communication. And here are the 6 areas that I would like to cover. First, this is really the introduction called fundamentals. Then I will touch upon crisis impact assessment and what that means for communicators specifically. And then we're going to talk about message development, which is critical in times of crisis. You want to have good messages going out internally and externally, which will hopefully at the end of the day have those who are the recipients of these messages not only receive the message, listen to it and so forth, but ultimately change behaviors. That's what this is all about. Then employee communication. In our experience, communicating with employees during this time, pandemic, is critical. There's really basically two stakeholder groups, or publics, if you want to use the communication term, that need to be your focus, your primary key audiences, and that would be customers and employees. We're going to talk about employees specifically a little bit later. And then I have a couple slides on crisis and media influence, and lastly, what you need, which is sort of summarizing the package and telling everyone, here are things that we recommend you put in place, you have in place in regards to crisis communication related to the pandemic, but also beyond that. All right, crisis communication, I like to turn to the wisdom of many. This is Wikipedia, what Wikipedia has to say. It's really a subspecialty of the public relations discipline or profession, and it's designed to protect and defend individual company or an organization that's facing a public challenge. And that's a public challenge to the reputation, and translating that into CEO talk, if you want to use that term, it's really a challenge to the bottom line. Nowadays, with social media, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, you can't really distinguish between reputation damage and financial damage. It's one and the same, essentially. And that's what we're telling those on corporate boards and senior leadership teams. Those who make the mistake and say, well, this is just communication, are definitely on the wrong track. And that is also depicted in the following slide. Crisis response communication is critical. We're a company, as I said earlier, that does crisis management work, including from an operational standpoint. And we have found over the last 20-some years that we've done work in these areas, that it's really about three things. When a crisis, including a pandemic such as COVID-19, happens, you need to have three decision-making areas aligned, and that is the managerial response, essentially managerial decision-making. What are we going to do? As leaders of an organization, you need to make tough decisions. Craig already talked a little bit about the fact that unfortunately DDI, and I know DDI a little bit, made a decision back in April to let go of a number of people, larger number of people, maybe percentage-wise. Well, workforce reduction is something that we've dealt with a lot with clients. Across the board, the pandemic has had clients reconsider what they need to do, and that falls into that category of managerial decision-making, where you have to make tough decisions. Right now, almost on a daily basis for some companies. We have clients in retail. Just this past weekend, I talked to a CEO with a chain of restaurants. Those folks have to be vigilant, make the right decisions, and some of them are unfortunately related to workforce reduction. Once you have made the decisions, you need to implement an operational response, which means you actually have to execute what has been decided. And that is actually informing people that as part of the workforce reduction, they are going to be released. It's about informing people regarding all kinds of things that are happening as far as those that remain with the company. And you need to implement these things. That's what we refer to as the operational response. And neither one of those can function well with one another, managerial and operational response, unless you have a stellar communication response in place. And that's where crisis communication comes into play. You need to have good internal and external communication. And in this age of social media, you certainly also need to be aware of and cater to those channels that we refer to as online channels. So social media is represented via the terminology online here. And it's those three areas that have to work hand in hand in order for your organization to be in a position to respond effectively to whatever crisis it may be. And that certainly also applies to pandemic response. We found that the pandemic is really a mega crisis, if you will. It's a crisis that's systemic, that touches upon all of the different functional areas within the company or within the organization. And you may refer to it as lots of smaller crises coming together and forming this concept of pandemic crisis, COVID-19. When we talk about communication response to crisis, it's really these 7 areas that we focus on with clients. And it very much comes down to a strategic approach that does not only include communication. There's a whole lot more in regards to crisis management to this. But here are the areas that are important from a communication point of view. You first of all always need to assess what is the impact of the crisis. And again, with the pandemic, that pretty much touches all areas of running an organization, whether you're a nonprofit or for-profit. And once you have an understanding of how exactly your organization is impacted with the different functions that you have within your company, you can then formulate business and subsequently communication objectives that are geared toward how will you address the situation. And the situation is fluid. As we certainly all know with the pandemic, things may change on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis sometimes. I've been on calls with senior leaders and we make some decisions, and literally an hour and a half later, we're on the call again because the parameters have changed and we need to reassess the situation and make different decisions potentially. Once you have these objectives in place, you will need to understand what your stakeholders' information needs are. And again, I want to highlight the customers as one stakeholder group, and then obviously employees as probably the two most critical during this time. And also generally speaking, when we're talking about crisis management outside of the pandemic. So whether you have an industrial accident or you have a sexual harassment case on your hands, the whole 9 yards, you will want to have stakeholder information needs assessed and then appropriately addressed, because that's what the communication component of your crisis response will have to tackle. Once you understand what those needs are, you will need to develop messages, and you would want to do so stakeholder group specific. So you will have an umbrella message, if you will, that's your first tier, and then you will want to fine-tune the messaging depending on the particular audience or stakeholder group. I use those two terms interchangeably. And obviously, again, we have internal and external audiences. I would strongly encourage everyone to communicate with internal audiences first. When you have whatever crisis on your hand, unless there is a limitation as a result of whatever regulation or law may be in place that you are not allowed to release information to internal stakeholders first, for instance, SEC related, then you should always communicate with your employees first, or at least simultaneously at the same time as you're communicating with external stakeholders. And once you have these messages all lined up, you will want to make decisions regarding the communication channels you want to use, as well as tools and venues. And what do we mean by that? So do you want to turn to social media? Do you want to utilize face-to-face communication? Venue would be, if you do it face-to-face, would it be inside a building along the lines of a town hall where you are addressing a larger number of employees? You should go through all this in terms of your planning process. Obviously, also, when is this communication going to happen, which is not specifically listed here, but you want to have a timeline in place so everybody is on the same page in terms of what exactly is going to happen. And then you need to, and I hope everybody is going to do this, at least to some degree, test messages. We find that a lot of, including clients, fail to test message. They have their messages lined up and they deliver them without ever having tested the messages. There are ways to do that. You may just, if it's an internal communication, run it by 1 or 2 employees first, depending on the size of your organization. That could be in different departments. There could be people, different hierarchical levels, and ask them, well, what do you think about this? Does this make sense to you? If it's just upper management discussing these things without potentially putting their thinking cap on and trying to put themselves in the shoes of employees a little lower on the totem pole, then they may miss some very important aspects that should be communicated. So again, running it by someone, seeking that feedback prior to the actual communication happening to a larger number of, let's say, employees or customers, you name it, is a very good idea. And once you've tested, you will want to deliver the message. And again, that has to do with your selection in terms of the channel, tool, and venue. And then you will also have, hopefully at least, you will have dedicated and appropriately trained spokespersons available. Any organization should have that. Even a small company that may not have more than 10 employees should have someone pre-designated for representing the organization in front of, for instance, the media. So if you have an inquiry from a journalist, you will want to have a designated and trained spokesperson handle this situation. If there's a media interview request that comes in elsewhere, you will want to have that person just take down the information and pass it on to the designated spokesperson so he or she can then be back in touch with the reporter. This ensures a coherent message and a message that will resonate more likely, at least, because it's an experienced person responding to the need. Yeah? We call this a one voice policy, where only designated people speak on behalf of the company and have been trained to do so and will utilize the specific messages that have been developed. And eventually you will obviously need to evaluate, adapt, and change. And in crisis communication, it's a different animal from, let's say you have a marketing campaign, where most likely your evaluation will happen, primarily at least, at the very end of the whole project or process. In crisis communication, you will have to evaluate simultaneously, meaning you will have to do it continuously as you are moving forward with your response strategy. So you have had communication with the employees. You can't wait until the crisis is over to check if that resonated with your audience. You need to do that right away. You need to see to it that you find out whether the communication was successful, as in everybody understood what they're now supposed to do or not to do or understand, and then check if this is actually what happened. A lot of companies we've worked with come to us and say, well, gee, our communication just doesn't work. We never get the results, and we don't find out until everything has ended in terms of critical situations. What can we do? Well, you got to evaluate as you go. And then you need to adapt based on your evaluation and ultimately change. That may include organizational change along the lines of appointing different people to different roles. And it may be reflected in what you may want to look into if you don't have it yet, having a crisis communication plan in place. Crisis communication keys, I'm just going to throw this out there. If ever you are in a position where you respond to a crisis, and that includes a pandemic, you want to be timely, truthful, consistent, and coordinated in terms of your communication. Yeah? Time is of the essence. Oftentimes when it's a quickly unfolding situation along the lines of an accident, for instance, you will want to have very quick communication going out. At the same time, you want to be accurate, and this is the conundrum. We have lots of conversations with attorneys almost on a daily basis when we work with our clients, because attorneys tend to say, well, less is always more, regardless of the situation. We don't want to admit to anything. We don't want to empathize too much. And then we are on the other side and say, hey, it's important that we're timely. We want to be truthful. We don't want to hide information. Yes, we may create a little bit of liability for ourselves there, but in the end, it's not only the court of law that we need to keep in mind. We also need to keep in mind there is a court of public opinion. And it may be much more costly for us to lose in the court of public opinion than to lose in a court of law and maybe pay a little bit there. Huh? So that's something that sometimes can be a little tricky. Pandemic-specific communication, COVID-19 specific communication, will ideally include a pandemic communication plan. And now that we're many weeks into this, I often hear, along with my colleagues, well, Oliver, isn't it way too late for us to develop a plan? No, it's not too late. I mean, the plan would just have to start right now. This is where we are. This is the status quo. And now we had better look into what can we do better. And mapping this out is a very good idea. There are tools that we use. I only mentioned two things here. We have a mapping tool to understand better about stakeholders, who they are, how they can be reached, what are their current opinions regarding a specific matter. And this can certainly be customized in regards to COVID-19 related communication. And then we also work with a matrix that may include stakeholder messages and channels. So we try to figure out what are we going to do for a specific stakeholder group regarding the tools that we will use and what are we actually going to say and how does that need to be adjusted. And then, as I said already, you want to have customers and employees during this time as definitely your focus stakeholder groups. There are others, obviously, across the board. You may want to have specific communication at any given time when you face a crisis with, let's say, regulators, with people who are in law enforcement, or folks that are representatives of government entities. That's certainly the case. But in this particular situation, pandemic, we are basically recommending across the board clear focus on customers and employees. I want to talk about specifically employees a little bit more in the communication there in a minute. Customizing, evaluating, two-way communication is really the key. What does that mean? You want to have feedback options integrated. If you just churn out messages for employees and they're not even in a position to ever provide feedback, be it because they're not invited to, not even allowed to, or they're just so shy, or whatever term you want to use, they just don't feel comfortable, then that's a big minus. Your organization had better be in a position to seek that input and to utilize it, because that can be very, very valuable as you move forward. For those of you who would like to get more information, feel free to send me an email. My contact information is also at the end of the deck. I will make that available following the presentation. You can send me an email and I can send a link to a recently published article on employee communication specifically during COVID-19, which may be useful to you. And at the end of the day, your messages need to be clear and easy to understand. That's the last of the bullets on this slide. Now, just a little bit regarding crisis impact assessment. And I don't want to harp on this too much, but typically what we see is senior management teams have what we call a technical or analytic approach. For them, it's all about math. It's all about statistics and probability, and what has happened here can be displayed in the form of a pie chart or numbers or whatever, and liabilities to be minimized and so forth. But what about emotions? And that's what a lot of management teams forget. There are real emotions involved in any crisis situation, and obviously especially when it comes to a pandemic, because we're all affected. Maybe not through our work directly, because we just happen to be an online-only business and we're basically unscathed. But as employees, we also have a personal life, and it may just be that our spouse just got laid off, or it may be that we don't have daycare available for our kids. So there are a lot of things that need to be kept in mind, and there are emotions in play. Therefore, we say that there is also a public view regarding crisis management and crises, and that is effective and emotional. And it's based on stakeholder perception. It is potentially involving stakeholder outrage. Just think about the Black Lives Matters movement that we're witnessing right now, right? With riots, with vandalism, unfortunately also. That's essentially stakeholder outrage, right? And we need to be aware of that and have in our corporate response and our organizational response these two things in mind: the analytic and the effective, which would be the public view as effective and emotional. And this is just a quick introduction here, but I want to make it very clear that a lot of the work that I do, that we do as C4CS, has to do with teaching senior management teams or management in general that they need to understand that there are emotions involved in these things, and they need to cater to that by being empathetic. You can't just talk about the facts as if this doesn't impact anything, and certainly emotionally, who cares? You got to show empathy. All right, message development. Here are 8 questions that we teach our clients have to be asked when it comes to mounting an effective crisis response. And for the pandemic, again, which touches on many, many different areas within organizations, you will want to probably drill down even deeper. But generally speaking, these are the questions that we would recommend. And again, you will receive the deck later, so you have that available. These are things that we would definitely recommend you keep in mind and try to address in your communication in response to crises, including the pandemic. Be very open about this, going back to the crisis communication tenets, timely and so forth, that were on the slide earlier. Stakeholder-specific communication then needs to ask 3 questions as you're setting out to develop messages. What do they think or do now, geared toward whatever stakeholder group you're dealing with? What do they care about? And lastly, what do you want them to think and do? And that's how you build your messages. You assess, where are they now? What do they care about? And then you put this is like an equation. Where do you want them to be? What do you want them to think and do ultimately? And that will then, out of this will flow your own messaging. And there are several things that you need to keep in mind. First off, there are so-called message requirements. That's what we call it. Number one, already touched upon it, messages must be true. To the best of your knowledge, don't make up stuff. Be truthful. Messages must sound true to the speaker. What do I mean by that? Well, if you have a spokesperson appear on television and that spokesperson looks everything but not like someone who believes in what they're saying while they're appearing on television, then that is not a credible spokesperson. So it must sound true to the speaker, and the speaker must believe in that message. If I'm a spokesperson for Butler Technologies, for instance, and I say things to others while not coming across as believable, then that's going to be counterproductive. In fact, it may do more damage, may do more harm at the end of the day than help us in any given situation. And lastly, messages must sound true to the audience, where very clearly, if it doesn't resonate with the audience, you might as well not have communicated in the first place, right? And that's what we need to work toward. They must be true, sound true to the speaker, as in our spokesperson, ideally, and it must sound true to the audience, to the stakeholder group that we're addressing. It's all about believability. And that is very true for the pandemic too. If you're addressing employees, external stakeholders, customers, do speak the truth, do have someone say these things and communicate that's trustworthy and credible, and then also see to it that you're believable. That if you have a problem with your supply chain right now, and I've had a lot of supply chain related issues and challenges and problems over the last month by now, then say so. Don't hold back and later find out that unfortunately you lost a big time customer because they aren't even that mad at you because the supply chain had a disruption and you weren't able to deliver the goods. But what they will be mad about is that you were not open about this, that they did not receive the heads up and didn't get the fair warning from you. And now everybody's looking at a situation that's very undesirable. Key messages. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this term or with the concept. Essentially, what we want to do is we want to, whenever we have an opportunity to speak, whether that's to employees, to the media, to customers, we ideally should have what we refer to in our discipline as key messages. That may be 3 things that we want to highlight when we communicate. And those need to be about facts, feelings, and actions. You see there's a little graphic there. That's what we call our C4CS message triangle. And what does that mean? Again, we want to talk about facts. We want to speak to what is actually happening, what is true. But we also want to address, remember the analytical approach versus the emotional approach as far as management and the general public is concerned. We do want for you to remember that there is something along the lines of empathy desperately needed in any kind of communication. And that's the word feelings right here. And lastly, also obviously pertaining to the pandemic, you need to be prepared to say what you are doing about things, right? If you are, as a management team, addressing the pandemic and you fail to communicate, A, these are the facts, or B, this is what we feel about this, or C, now here's what we collectively can do about this in order to prevail, then your organization is going to suffer, right? So these 3 areas need to come together in order to make a difference. Employee communication specifically. Let's remember that employees are key assets. Without them, you can't function. And I bet, Craig, that by now DDI has found out that there are any number of things that you used to do which are now missing, right? And they're saying, well, gee, Craig is unfortunately no longer there. He has been here for 20 years. I bet you there is now there's now a void. All the things that Craig knew about the organization that he did over a 20+ year period, well, are we going to turn to the newbie who has been here for half a year to fill us in regards to these things? No, you can't, because the organizational knowledge is not there and all that experience is now gone. So You need to understand that well-informed, qualified, experienced, dedicated employees are key. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm saying it anyway. Your question, therefore, needs to be, how can you help employees as well as their loved one, in extension, during this particular trying time? What specifically can you do? And you got to understand that all of your employees, I made a mention a minute ago, are currently experiencing stress. Maybe not so much at work because everything is, for whatever reason, okay, at least at the moment. But then there's all the stuff happening at home, and they may have a loved one who is currently battling COVID-19, right? Could be someone hospitalized. I mean, you name it. All kinds of scenarios are possible. So what does all this lead to? It leads to uncertainty, pressure, anxiety, and stress as far as employees are concerned. Lots of different stressors, including, as just said, health concerns, job concerns, and so forth. And what is it that employees have in terms of needs and what they're looking for? Well, according to a Gallup research that was done just a couple of weeks ago, everyone is looking for stability, hope, compassion, and trust. Those are the things that we are, as employees, expecting from our employers. And we had better have employers cater to these needs in order for there to be a cohesive unit as far as the employee base is concerned, which will then enable the company to prevail. And for an employee, any employee at this time, it's obviously very important to know, well, what's the clear way forward? I'm saying that all the time on call. I do a lot of executive coaching with senior leaders, and they keep telling me, well, I'm hesitant to speak the truth. Just tell everyone we are in a very, very difficult position, and the situation is not going to get better. And even if we pivot, we may have to shed another X number of employees. Well, do be very upfront about these things. And for your organization, it's hopefully not as dire as it is for many of the organizations that I have worked with over the last few months. But the very clear forward to communicate that is so important. Employees actually do want to be resilient, and they do want to help, but they need to be empowered to do so. That's what it boils down to. And there's very practical support along the lines of, I've listed a few things here: unpaid leave, health insurance, flex time, remote work, certainly personal protective equipment if your company happens to be in an area where there is, and many are obviously, where there's direct contact with the outside world or others that may be infected, in order to not contract COVID-19 or the coronavirus and have that then develop into the disease that is called COVID-19. Personal protective equipment is certainly one of the items that can make a huge difference for your employees as they're out there in the community or even just at work. You want to, as an employee, see that vision, values, mission, that has to be lived by the company. And even if you don't have that written down because you're a smaller organization that never really looked into identifying these things, you will have a general idea of how your company should function. What are the ethical guideposts? And that needs to be lived now. Very critically, that needs to be put in place. And at the end of the day, it is effective communication that is a must, because only effective communication in response to the pandemic will enable you to have employees buy into what it is that you need to do. And unfortunately, we see that that is sometimes not the case, and therefore I'm using this little cartoon here. Okay, people, the question is, should we deny first and then delay, or delay first and then deny? And you actually do see this. I mean, I run into these situations, not as drastic as depicted here, but where senior managed teams are reluctant, continue to be reluctant to speak the truth, to say, hey, this is what it is. And we then encourage them. I, as an executive coach, outside consultant, certainly do encourage them to move forward and tell everyone how it is and what needs to be done to move forward successfully. We're nearing the end here. Crisis and media influence. Obviously, the media, big component when it comes to crisis response. I did want to point out that it's definitely important to utilize print, broadcast, and social media relationships that you may have in place. If you receive any increase, if you are under scrutiny, under pressure from anything that got published, do understand that you need to respond there. I mean, you can't just not do anything. Some of the criticism may actually be very relevant, right? And use it as an opportunity. So be a little more introspective and say, hey, is there anything that we should look into? Is that criticism valid? And if it's not, then you still need to communicate and say so, and say to a specific media outlet, well, I would like to set the record straight here. Some of the things that you've said are not actually true. Give me an opportunity to address that, please. No? So media interaction can and often does make a huge difference in terms of how you come out of it, and in fact can be the determinant when it comes to, is this going to be successful or not, what you're mounting in terms of a response. You know? Realistic expectations, another little cartoon here. Okay, but what I'm about to tell you does not leave this news cycle. I do talk to people all the time, and they say, well, once we come out with this, this is big news, we understand, but it's not going to take more than a day or so for this to percolate as far as the media is concerned. I say, no, it's not in our hands. Our messaging needs to be as best as possible, and then it's in the media's hand what we're going to see. We can certainly influence this process, but at the end of the day, it's the editor, it's the producer. When you talk about traditional media, and certainly on the social media side, everybody, including you and me, are we going to turn to our Facebook account or Twitter and churn something out just because we feel like it? And it's not that you can control that. You can control it in a way, but at the end of the day, certainly not 100%. So we need to remember that. And one vehicle to influence that process is certainly media interviews. We want to have media interviews and news conferences viewed by our clients as valuable opportunities to get the word out. Because if you don't speak to a crisis unfolding or a crisis event just having happened, then there is an information vacuum. And the reporters whose job it is, whose very job it is to seek information in regards to that, report on it, and so forth, will find others to speak to the event. And then your side of the story is not even included in the news report. And that's something that we need to avoid. So look at it as an opportunity. It takes practice. Wait a minute, how did we get onto the subject? How indeed? You do need to practice these things. We do a lot of media training, crisis communication training. Some of the things that we do as part of that are certainly surrounding techniques. How do you respond to a specific type of question? There are certain tactics that we teach and so forth. And keep in mind that practice makes perfect obviously applies to this area too. Lastly, just a little bit about social media and crisis management. And it certainly also applies to the pandemic we're going through right now. All of us know by now, huge ever-growing number of social media users. Facebook alone has well over 1 billion users now. I'm not even sure what the current number is. What we need to keep in mind from a communication viewpoint is traditional journalists utilize social media, and you may have heard about shrinking newsrooms, so there is fewer journalists in especially print, and those have a lot of different beats now. They used to maybe have just one area in terms of their focus. Now they wear many different hats, and they have to do an incredible amount of work. As a result, they turn increasingly to social media for story ideas, fact-checking, and so forth. But the problem is that what you find on social media is uncensored. That's a big difference. If you look at print, broadcast, those are media and journalists that adhere to ethical codes, that have editors in place, that have producers in place, that look to it, that information that's churned out is accurate. And with social media, it's different. You and I can go online and rant pretty much as we please. There's very, very little that can be done uncensored. It's also global, immediate. You put something out and the whole world can see it. If you have it via RSS or whatever other tool circling the globe, right away, even though the initial tweet only went out to, let's say, 50 people. If everybody else forwards it and so forth, then it can very quickly snowball into and develop into a lot of damage. And that's really what it's about. It's also automated, syndicated, long-lasting, doesn't go away. On the other hand, there are a few opportunities. I don't want to highlight those too much because they pale in contrast to the potential damage. But you certainly can utilize social media for enhanced stakeholder dialogue. Impact measurement is possible, stakeholder notification, even identification. So different things are also playing into your hands. You know? And I want to conclude, because we're pretty advanced here as far as the time is concerned, I want to conclude with what is it that you need? Well, you should have, when it comes to crisis communication, including related to this pandemic, you need to have a crisis readiness assessment that you need to do yourself, that you need to have other people do for you if this is the route you want to go. And there you need to assess, where am I in terms of my readiness, my preparedness level to communicate effectively to internal and all external audiences. And it's basically what you found as part of this presentation. These are the things that need to be in place, right? I didn't even explain it further, but you do need and should have a crisis communication plan. Lots of different components to that. It doesn't have to be a written document that spans 1,000 pages or whatever. Ideally, it can be very, very short, have some planning in place for specifically COVID-19, and see to it that everybody understands what the common goal is, and then go about putting that into place. That's what it boils down to. And it all starts with those, as explained earlier, business objectives that then result in communication objectives, right? They are very closely interlinked, and you need to see to it that by implementing the communication, you reach those goals, those objectives. You also want to have a pandemic response team in place, maybe even a communication team if you're a larger organization, potentially Fortune 500 or whatever. That's very important. This team will have different functional areas represented on it. There needs to be a communicator, and these folks should meet on a regular basis and discuss, where are we, where do we want to be, need to be, and how do we get there. C4CS is actually part of this endeavor with a number of our clients, where we are a standing member for such a team for specific organizations, receive alerts, and get pulled in on an as-needed basis, and then instruct clients specifically regarding crisis communication. I mentioned previously, I think, a one-voice policy, which means you want to sing from the same song sheet. It's got to be coherent messaging. The media policy falls in line with that. It basically means that only those designated as official spokespersons are ever permitted to directly address the media in an interview type situation, for instance. And last but not least, 5 and 6, social media crisis strategy needs to be in place, and you must have in place some sort of monitoring. There were no slides pertaining to this here, but I would strongly encourage any organization, no matter the size, to have traditional and social media monitoring in place. We do this for a number of clients where we have specific keywords, might be as many as 50 or whatever, and then we have automated monitoring in place where we receive results on a minute-by-minute basis, actually, and then we can send out alerts to our clients and the designated group of people regarding a particular issue that has popped up, or if we're tracking something, it's developing in a different direction. That certainly also pertains to pandemic response-related situations. Yeah? So there are a number of companies that are receiving at the end of each workday a list of media articles that have popped up during the day from us, just to keep abreast with what's happening, what's going on in terms of the regulatory space, politics, how does it affect how we operate our business, and so forth. And then a reminder, training is certainly important, and since practice makes perfect, you may very well want to look into training for better crisis communication for your team. And that includes media interaction as well. You know? that concludes what I wanted to share with you today. We have a Q&A, and I would love to invite you to ask questions. While we're going through your questions, I do want to have the following slide up as a reminder. It is far better to prepare and prevent than to repair and repent. And I hope at this point you will agree with me that indeed the preparation is key. Readiness, planning, and building is what needs to happen, and ideally long before a crisis happens. But on the other hand, it's not too late at this point to do something in regards to being better prepared for pandemic response. All right, any questions?
So opening it up to questions, we do have one that Craig, you put in the chat. I wonder if you could ask that.
Absolutely. So Oliver, my question is, a lot of organizations were probably better prepared heading into the COVID-19 crisis because they are organizations that regularly or have experience handling crises. But as for other organizations, what can or should they do to sort of grow their muscle, if you will, so that they're better prepared to handle crises in the future? And I guess ultimately the question is, what should organizations be doing in times between crises to make sure they're better prepared? I know you've alluded to some of those, but just anything else you would add.
Right. Well, I appreciate the question very much, Craig. There is a slide that we typically show which speaks to that very profoundly. We in crisis management, and again, crisis communication is a component of that, we have 3 phases that we look at. There is the pre-crisis phase, the crisis response phase, and the post-crisis phase. And it is very important that any organization, if at all possible, dedicate resources toward increasing crisis readiness during the pre-crisis phase. And that's something that's true for companies that may only have 5 employees, as well as for companies that have 50,000 employees. And we work with companies across the board, independent of size. And our motto always is, the sooner you get started with the process, the better. That doesn't mean that you have to spend very large amounts of money and go through the whole process, very detailed. It's oftentimes for a very small organization, I wouldn't say sufficient, but at least a difference maker if the group of managers, the group of owners potentially come together and say, hey, if something happened, what would we actually do? How would we be able to mount an adequate response, since we've never really brainstormed what some of the crises might actually look like. Yeah? So we have 2 things that we do with management teams as part of the development process and readiness building process. One thing very, very critical is scenario planning, and this is what I'm essentially talking about here. So during the pre-crisis phase, you will want to ask yourself 2 questions, and you don't even need me to facilitate that necessarily. If you're a smaller organization, just ask yourself these 2 questions. 1, what are the most impactful crises that could befall our organization? Make a list, make an actual list, put down 3 to 5 different crisis scenarios and rank them according to which of these would be most impactful, as in which of these would be the most negative if they actually occurred. And once you have that list, 3 to 5, whatever you want to do there, involve others, management team-wide, you ask yourself the following question, which is the second, and it should come in this order. Which of the 5 or so that you have listed now along the lines of the most impactful are the most likely to actually occur? It's a simple risk management tool, essentially, where you look at what's the most impactful. That list is then used to assess which of these are the most likely to occur, and boom, you have your scenario. You want to plan around what you have then listed at or near the top. And that's what you should also focus on in terms of your training. So we guide companies through this process, work with large organizations, but at the end of the day, what I just gave you is essentially the tools if you're a smaller outfit. Yeah? And then we can come in with larger organizations and build scenarios. We build scenarios along the lines of what is the worst case, what is the best case, and typically reality will happen somewhere in the middle, right? You're very unlikely to hit the worst case lottery win, and that's good. But on the other hand, you may very well find yourself looking at not something that's even remotely close to the best case either. So it will be somewhere in the middle. And then you develop a scenario, you develop training around it, you develop the tools that will be needed, and you will designate people as a result of wanting to ready your organization to appropriately and successfully handle this type of situation. And it caters to the crisis communication needs that we went over just as well. Does that make sense, Craig? Is that pretty much what you were looking for here?
It definitely does. That's fantastic.
Thank you. Any other questions for me?
Nothing else from the group?
Okay.
I do have one with you, but it's not a very easy
Sure.
question. You know, you had mentioned everything that's been going on in the media today, and you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I've talked with other colleagues where they were saying, you know, should a company put out some type of communication regarding that? They mentioned that by not doing it, you could potentially be making a statement. So I wanted to get your opinion on whether or not it's important for companies that maybe, you know, don't exactly have any type of political standing, you know, by saying something, you know, they could negatively impact their
Yeah, good.
their company.
Definitely a very relevant question right now, Jamie. I've discussed that very question several times just this past week with clients, including larger companies. It's always when I get questions regarding how do you see this particular scenario, I want to remind everyone, first of all, that it's always company specific. So I can't make a broad stroke type assessment and subsequently recommendation here. But by and large, I'd say that if you are a company that typically does not stand in the limelight so much because you're not a B2C business, you don't produce potato chips or whatever, and everybody in the world knows you or whatever. If you're sort of behind the scenes, generally speaking, and on top of that, you hardly ever, if ever, have commented on anything political, then you gotta stay away from it. Okay. If you have specific questions from employees and they might criticize you for not taking a stand, then that's a different story, right? Then that's where the situation changes, and you may feel that if there is a movement within your own employee base, you had better consider having some sort of communication. Whether that needs to go out to all of the employees and be public so that even media could pick up on it is a different story. And that's where that case-by-case assessment comes in, Jamie. Yeah, but I would want to, as a general guideline, if you will, encourage companies that unless there is reason to address it along the lines of people actually asking external or internal stakeholders, and you have been a little more open about your political stance in the past anyway, I would say that it's better to err on the side of caution for sure. Because as soon as you start communicating, you create the expectation that you as a company have an opinion, and you may find that now that you've started communicating, employees are waking up and saying, hey, what you just said is the case for our company is not in line with my personal ideas and thoughts, and I don't feel myself adequately represented there. And so it can open up a whole lot of problems for you down the road. That's why I typically would say or on the side of caution. But again, it requires an assessment that needs to be company specific and situation specific. You know?
Okay, thank you.
Good, excellent. The very last slide really is the contact information. I will make the deck available, Jamie, that can go through you, Lauren, to everyone who was on the call.
That'd be great.
I'd be glad to share the slides in PDF form. And it does include the contact information. If any of you have additional questions, would like to know more, I might also send out the link to the article I mentioned earlier regarding effective employee communication in COVID-19. That's all at your disposal. And if there is a follow-up requested, by all means, contact me. You can do so directly, and then I'll be more than happy to engage and answer any questions that you may have. Yeah? So we ran a little bit over the time here, but I think we used the time wisely, and I want to thank everyone for being a part of the session today. I certainly enjoyed having everyone on this Zoom call. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate your time, and thanks to everybody for attending. Anybody that has joined the meeting, Lauren and I will make the slides available to you. So again, thank you.
All right. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Oliver.
Okay. Bye now. Have a good one.